Nintendo had two great generations of gaming before the PlayStation stepped in to dethrone them from the top. As the N64 failed to meet sales expectations as soon as a better competitor stormed in. During the 6th generation console race, Nintendo had the GameCube and Sony had their PlayStation 2, which was vastly outselling everything else on the market. However, while Nintendo had been losing in terms of home console sales, their handheld division was incredibly powerful, as the Game Boy Advance had no solid competition. And in 2004, we got the Nintendo DS, which was an amazing release and one of Nintendo's most popular handheld releases ever. There are so many awesome things about the DS, but interestingly enough, Sony had been working on a handheld of their own. This one was very groundbreaking due to it being the most powerful and forward-thinking approach that the handheld market had ever witnessed. In 2005, Sony released the PlayStation Portable in North America, and yes, the PSP was better than you thought. The PSP had been leaked like almost everything does in today's society, which led to many assumptions that did not become true right away. First, we saw leaks of Sony releasing a portable with totally flush buttons, almost resembling a modern-ish looking MP3 player with a bright display for gaming. The PSP released with a much more palatable design and some great surprises along with it. The PSP is a handheld that combines multiple aspects of the industry and even other industries into one device, and it genuinely was a very refreshing entry, but during a time where we would have to separate devices for a lot of our media needs, including music, movies, communication, and gaming, the PSP was an all-in-one device. The PSP could do a lot, and it was beautifully designed from the get-go. On the front, you will find a very familiar layout for PlayStation users, which includes the directional buttons, which are split square, triangle, circle, and X buttons. These buttons are spongier than those on a DualShock 2 controller, but they do feel good. Also, they have this reflective look, as the logos are actually recessed to the base of the button, but from the front it looks like they are looking right at you at the top. It's a cool effect, and it does add some style to the PSP, but this time we do get a thumbstick, which is a pretty new concept for a handheld gaming device, and one that inspired much iteration in future devices. This was something that I believe was missing from the DS, specifically because of its 3D capabilities, where navigating a game like Mario 64 DS was more uncomfortable than it should have been. This is a textured nub that does indeed offer analog controls, as it detects a full range of motion, not just 4 directions. On the bottom, you do get a whole suite of buttons, including a home button, volume controls, brightness toggle button, a mute button, and a start and select buttons. These buttons don't have too much travel, but they do have feedback from these nonetheless. Of course, you do get your L and R shoulder buttons with a satisfying spring. This device has a sleep-wake button switch, which also has the ability to hold your PSP, which means that you can lock all button functionality from it if needed, in case you're using this as an MP3 player. On the bottom, you will find a DC in port to let you charge the PSP, and this charger just uses this power supply, which isn't amazing to travel with, but the PSP did need it. On the bottom left, you will find a headphone jack with a peripheral port right next to it for other accessories like a media remote. Then on the left side, you will find a Wi-Fi switch, because the PSP actually comes with good Wi-Fi support from the factory, and you can turn this off if you want to preserve your battery. Right next to that, there is a memory stick slot with proprietary storage, which Sony loves to use for generations. But for these memory sticks, I believe that I have seen up to 64 gigabytes of storage, which was large for a handheld at the time. On the top, there is an IR sensor for turning this PSP into a remote for your TV, and even a mini USB port, which was meant for data transfers from your PSP to your PC, as you can store much more than just games on here. Then there's the display, which is actually the first time that we saw a 16:9 aspect ratio being embraced on a handheld gaming device. This boasts a resolution of 480 by 272, and this is a backlit display. This screen is not the most colorful or saturated, but it is genuinely the best screen that we had on a gaming handheld, where landscape, widescreen formats were being prioritized. This model offers 4 levels of brightness, and it does get pretty bright at the brightest setting. And there are a few reasons why Sony embraced this format for content on the PSP. This is evidenced by one massive feature on the PSP: the UMD drive. UMD stands for Universal Media Disc, as it is an optical media device that plays discs. It plays these proprietary mini discs that were exclusive to Sony's platform. These discs are encased in this plastic, and they will only work with these as the drives are designed around this. These UMDs hold up to 1.8 gigabytes of storage, which was actually a huge deal considering that the DS's cartridges could only hold up to less than a third of that. So for reference, GameCube mini disc could only hold 1.46 gigabytes, which meant that these UMDs could hold even more game data. This was a pretty big deal for a portable gaming device, and the use of this form of optical media allowed the PSP to also become a movie and music player. That's right, you can purchase movies to watch on the go, as well as music to listen to if you'd like. And when you're done or feel like something else, you could always just play a game. This was a very forward-thinking approach as it turned an awesome gaming device into a full entertainment system. But like with anything regarding discs, these cases would fall apart over time, and the discs would become exposed to tons of debris with no real safe way of storing them or even playing them after a while. Also, these are not super portable compared to cartridges, which meant that you more than likely only carried one or two of these around unless you also had a backpack with you to store all of your other games with like its own disc case and stuff like that. And of course, we have to talk about the interface of the PSP. This is so clean and minimalistic, offering a much more complete operating system than we were used to seeing before on other handhelds. You could access settings, a web browser, any digitally stored media, which includes photos and videos, change themes, and so much more. Compared to the DS, the PSP felt so complete, and it could do everything within the context of 2005. You could even purchase media digitally through the PlayStation Store, and of course, play online. The PSP also has an easily accessible 1800 mAh battery that is simple to remove and replace. This battery would last about 5 hours, oftentimes less, as there was a lot happening on the PSP and it did not have amazing long-lasting battery performance. The PSP has come across some issues with the battery exploding, which could cause some more damage to your device. This has been happening for years now, and many people have reported this issue. Nevertheless, the PSP launched at $249, which was not very cheap in the context of 2005, but compared to the DS, it certainly was on the pricey side, especially when you consider that most people that purchased a PSP more than likely already had a PlayStation 2 that they paid just $50 more than just a few years back. The PSP was expensive, but it did so much that I believe that the price was justified. The PSP had a very successful launch, as many have been anticipating it for quite some time. And when something like the Game Boy Advance was advertising itself as having console quality gaming experience, even if to me it never felt that way, the DS didn't quite achieve those console quality graphics that we'd expected. However, the PSP brought us much closer to that vision. These are the games that made the PSP so great. The PSP was marketed as not only delivering console quality gaming on the go, but also being a portable PlayStation 2 with an asterisk on top. This is because the PSP tried giving us console quality experiences on the go, which include many franchises that we've been seeing exclusively on the PlayStation 2 being brought over to the PSP. But it wasn't just these franchises being brought over, as these games really did look and feel like PlayStation 2 games, but in the palm of your hands. Many of these games were beautifully stylized to fit really well into a portable, and because of this, even to this day, these games look pretty good, and just as I remember. But these experiences came with many development challenges, as a PSP was not considered to be a smooth platform to develop for. This was due in part to the limited memory on the PSP and the fact that the PSP's SDK tools were pretty complex to work with. As such, the platform itself had lots of proprietary implementations that made it more difficult to work with, while the DS offered a much more inviting ecosystem to develop for. As such, the PSP's library was a lot smaller than that of the DS's. However, we received so many great experiences on this platform, and I wouldn't have pictured them anywhere else. Games like God of War: Chains of Olympus was absolutely amazing, as it felt like a true God of War game and it looked like one to boot, offering cinematic experiences and a very engaging combat system. We also got games like GTA Chinatown Wars, which did make it to the DS as well, but it was such a great experience on the PSP as it was. One of my favorite games on this platform was a port of Persona 3, known as Persona 3 Portable. This is a huge game with lots of great additions, which makes it feel more like a remaster in some cases, but in others does feel like a bit of a demake in turn. Still an absolutely amazing game. We also saw Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions, which was a very welcome addition to the PSP's library, which also featured Final Fantasy IV and the after years, Final Fantasy III, II, and I, all of which were remakes of these original titles. We of course got Crisis Core, which had an amazing story and a pretty engaging combat system, not to mention one of the best soundtracks available on any Final Fantasy game. We did get to see a few Disgaea games: Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, Ridge Racer, Tekken 5, Little Big Planet, Velocity, Daxter, Burnout Legends, GTA Vice City, SOCOM, a bunch of sports games of course, racing games, Valkyrie Profile, Soul Calibur, lots more Metal Gear, Persona 2 Innocent Sin, a port of Persona 1, and so much more. Some of my favorite mentions would be the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Hero games, which brought us a spin-off Ultimate Ninja series of games onto the PSP. And these games looked and played very similarly to the real one. We got a Dragon Ball Shin Budokai game, Bleach, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Tag Force games were absolutely incredible too, Mortal Kombat Unchained, Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep is also super important to mention, and Dissidia Final Fantasy. All of these games offered awesome experiences, to me at least. While the PSP didn't have a giant library of games for every single type of gamer out there, I definitely believe that the library was quite good as it was. And while most of these games would have been possible, if not even a better experience on the PlayStation 2, they did still fit pretty well into a handheld format. However, many people disagreed with this notion, as they actually felt like these were experiences meant for the living room. They didn't feel like handheld gaming experiences, which did cause a bit of a divide between consumers. The PSP was a very interesting concept that managed to sell really well upon its launch, but as Nintendo introduced the DS Lite to the scene in 2006 with a very sleek design that only made already available games look and feel way better, the PSP had to fight much harder to compete. Not to mention that just 1 year after that, the original iPhone dropped into the scene as exactly everything that the PSP was trying to be, while being a phone on top of that. As such, shortly after, Sony released the PSP Slim, or 2000 model as we know it. The PSP 2000 came at a time where media streaming was starting to gain traction, and the iPhone made that pretty clear when it launched, as this was also an all-in-one device for media consumption. The DS was also having to deal with the advent of the iPhone, and then the App Store with $1 games for quick, on-the-go mobile experiences. Personally speaking, the PSP 1000 model was already great in terms of size and form factor, but I was surprised to see what they managed with the PSP 2000. So for the most part, there aren't many differences whatsoever between the PSP 1000 and 2000 models, but the differences are enough to make an impact on many consumers. The front layout remains identical with the analog nub feeling and functioning the same as before. The directional and face buttons overall feel exactly the same as before, but the stereo speakers were moved to the top of the front shell when they used to be on the bottom. However, the rest of the media-centric buttons remain pretty much untouched as they are. On the bottom, you will find that the headphone jack and peripherals connections have been slightly moved, while the 5V charger remains almost the same as well. The shoulder buttons feel almost exactly the same, and the mini USB port is still in the same spot, but the Wi-Fi switch was moved to the top, right next to that USB port. The back was redesigned to be glossy and now almost completely flat, rather than having the bump from before. This is because the PSP 2000 is 19% thinner and 33% lighter. Believe it or not, this makes a significant difference in terms of its ergonomics. The PSP 2000 honestly feels better than the 1000 model, and I never complained about the size and weight of the 1000 model until I tried this slim 2001 for myself. This does make a difference in how you hold your device, and I find myself playing on this model more often because of how nice it feels in hand. It's slightly more portable, definitely more pocketable, and even has some new features. The PSP 2000 is compatible with an accessory that lets you connect it to your TV and use this as a home console if you want to. This wasn't a feature that was used all too often, but it was meant to address those that just wanted a home console experience from their PSPs. Additionally, the PSP 2000 model had 64 megabytes of RAM, which was primarily used by other apps like Skype and the internet browser. Games didn't use it too much, as most were designed around the 32 megabyte limitation of the previous model. They also addressed the battery issue, as these came with a 1200 mAh battery instead of the 1800 mAh battery from before. While smaller, battery life was actually largely the same between both models, and this one still had access to an upgradable 2200 mAh battery. if you wanted one. But as far as I know, these batteries won't be blowing up as easily. Otherwise, the screen and operating systems remain largely the same. Another cool improvement that some people didn't like but I did was that they changed the UMD slot mechanism to now open with just your fingers through a magnetic enclosure. I like this more because I do believe that it's more satisfying to use. However, the 2000 model seems to have a less reliable reader, as these break down much more easily than they did on the PSP 1000 models. Of course, a laser going bad is just an inevitability of dealing with optical media, and the PSP is no exception to that rule. Otherwise, the PSP Slim or 2000 model is a nice quality of life update that is definitely worth looking into, and it did end up catching some eyes at the time. The PSP Slim was definitely a nice revision and probably one of the most impactful ones throughout the PSP's life cycle, but advancements were being made all over the place in terms of technology. While the PSP 2000 was great, Sony decided that they could still continue refining the PSP into something that is at least a little bit better than before. So in 2008, they gave us the PSP 3000. This model of the PSP is a slight refinement compared to the 2000 model, but this one truly is as close to a carbon copy to the 2000 model as you could get. The buttons are pretty much the same, the speakers are located on the same spot, and everything else really remains the same, including the form factor, size, and weight. But the 3000 model only has 3 brightness levels instead of the 4 from before, and the home button now has a PlayStation logo. The screen itself has been a topic of contention, as some say that it is a technical downgrade from the PSP 2000 screen. Some people say that there are scan lines on the display. Personally, I never noticed. And this screen still looks pretty good to me, even compared to my 2000 model. But it now even has an anti-reflective coating on the display to make it easier to play outdoors on a sunny day. The UMD reader on the 3000 model has been more reliable also, and it loads content more quickly than previous revisions from everything that I have tested. Also, did you know that a microphone was added to the 3000 model? This was for voice chats mostly, which helps to cement this more as a communications device, even if it didn't have any cameras for video chatting. Considering that the PSP 3000 launched in 2008, some aspects of it were becoming a little bit dated. When there are so many smartphones out on the market at this point, people have their hands on a more accessible gaming device already, with so many apps and games available on these devices, most of which cost $1 to buy and play, while offering a simpler handheld experience for those who just want to play a quick game. Also, the PSP wasn't being used so much for digital content at this stage, probably because people were starting to watch content on their PlayStation 3s at home and their TVs, or even just using their phones instead. Not to mention that carrying UMDs around just wasn't so appealing after a while. The 3000 model is really cool, but it's not that much different from the 2000 model. Honestly, all models of the PSP are great in their own way, and this one is probably just a little bit better than the rest. After 2 whole revisions of the original PSP for a grand total of 3 models, the PSP was beginning to fall out of favor for some people, as the DS had been releasing some of their best games at this point, and the PSP was becoming a little bit stale. Smartphones are starting to become a big deal, but sliding phones with keyboards such as the Sidekick are still really popular. In a move to capitalize on this trend and the rise of digital distributions, Sony released a very different model from what we've seen before in 2009. This is the PSP Go, but that's not it, because later we got the PSP Street in Europe during 2011. This is insane. The PSP Go is a very interesting device because this is the true slim model that we never knew we wanted but definitely didn't need. The PSP Go has a 3.8-inch display running at the same resolution of 480 by 272. This is pretty bright and a beautiful addition to the lineup. The Go model still has stereo speakers on the front, and the home button is now situated on the left side of the screen. The Go still has a sleep-wake button on the right with a locking mechanism, but most of the functions were moved to the top. The shoulder buttons are now smaller, thinner, but they still feel pretty good to press. And the brightness control, volume controls, and mute buttons were moved to the top. By the way, this display now has 4 levels of brightness, which is a nice improvement from the 3000 model's 3 brightness levels. Then on the bottom, you will find a headphone jack and a brand new proprietary charging port that also works for data. So they are combined ports now. The Wi-Fi switch has moved to the left side, and the memory card slot still remains in the same location, but the PSP Go is now using a new kind of proprietary storage known as Memory Stick Micro. It serves no other purpose than just requiring an additional purchase from its consumers. So thankfully, the Go model does come with 16 gigabytes of storage this time around, which is a nice improvement. But it has this much storage because this is a digital-only handheld. You cannot play your UMDs on this whatsoever. That's exactly why this device is so thin and pocketable, as one of the largest components of the PSP was removed entirely in favor of digital distribution. But one awesome thing is how they hid the buttons behind this sliding mechanism. This is exactly what I think of when I think about the late 2000s. This sliding mechanism is incredibly satisfying, and I hope to buy a sidekick as well in the future just to use as a fidget toy. Then these buttons underneath are low profile, so they are much clickier than ever. The thumb nub is now towards the center, along with the start and select buttons, which is not great for comfort, but it works depending on the size of your hands. Believe it or not, the PSP Go is the most expensive PSP model that you can purchase as of 2025, which speaks to its cool factor and to how very few people actually purchase this bad boy. The PSP Go also has this lock screen that shows the time whenever you slide it downwards to close it, which is just really cool. It also powers on automatically as soon as you slide it upwards. That's just awesome. In terms of its performance, it's all the same as before, but battery life is not as good, as you will usually get around 3 to 5 hours of battery life depending on what you're playing. Many people were turned off by the digital distribution aspect, even if it just clarified to us that Sony was getting ready to phase out UMDs at this point. If you cannot play most of your, or I should say all of your physical library on this model of the PSP, then of course I can see why you would look away. This was the last model that we saw in North America, but in Europe, they got to see the PSP Street, which is actually quite beautiful. I've never seen one in person, but it has a matte finish instead, and the buttons are now flat. But this is just a very beautiful handheld if you ask me. It's a more budget-conscious iteration, as it now has a mono speaker and no Wi-Fi capabilities whatsoever. This is fine for people who just want to play games anywhere, but in an age where online was becoming so huge in the gaming scape, this also wasn't super appealing to most people. Neither model got too much attention, and frankly, there were just too many PSP models at this point with little innovation. The PSP was quite the lucrative experiment for Sony, as they were dominating in the home console space with the PlayStation 2, so they definitely jumped on this niche at a great time. But during the 7th generation, the Wii was leading in sales, even if the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 weren't far behind at all, but the PSP was losing steam pretty quickly. Just a few years later, and its newer models were not necessarily bringing the kind of attention that Sony hoped for. At the end of the day, the PSP was an incredibly forward-thinking concept that unfortunately was only the case in the short term. By the time Sony went all in with the PSP, just a few short years later, smartphones would become a thing, and your home console was already a better media device for the big screen, so all of these benefits and features were not being so widely used. Going into the early 2010s, the PSP was still the most powerful gaming handheld of its generation and a very strong competitor in the handheld space that the industry desperately needed, as Nintendo shouldn't be the only ones constantly taking over. PSP really was awesome, and it came at a time where the industry really needed to see more competition. The PSP's emergence, as well as smartphones, forced Nintendo to keep pushing forward with the DS until they eventually released the 3DS in 2011. PSP continued its run until it was finally discontinued in 2014. Nevertheless, Sony proved that there was definitely room for them to invade the handheld market, and they did it with lots of success, even if they were disappointed by the results. The PSP line sold 80 million units, which was far behind from the DS's 154 million units, but it was incredible for a first attempt. Sony has no idea the legacy that they left behind and the one that they screwed over later on, but this was a handheld that they supported quite well. As mentioned earlier, Sony had been working on phasing out the UMD drive with the PSP Go, as seemingly the entertainment industry is favoring a digital distribution a little bit more. By that, I mean the ability to download apps, have a much more convenient storage solution for your physical games, and still be able to stream or even store everything that you'd like. As such, Sony came up with their follow-up in 2012. We will talk about this one very soon, so stay tuned and subscribe so that you don't miss it. And thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments about any topics you'd like me to touch on for a bite-sized documentary or a video like this one. And until next time.